Geopolitics reigning supreme this Friday. United States versus Iran. A U.S. airstrike has killed key Iranian and Iraqi military personnel, including the Iranian Major General Qaseem Soleimani, in an early surprise morning airstrike. The deputy chief of Iraq's parliamentary force was also killed in the attack. This strike comes close after the rocket attack last month that had killed an American contractor working in Iraq. The U.S. Embassy has already issued a directive instructing U.S. citizens to leave Iraq immediately. On its part, Iran is vowing harsh revenge. Iraq is going to be holding an emergency parliament session tomorrow to discuss future steps. Donald Trump has proclaimed victory on Twitter. He says, and I quote, "Iran never won a war, never lost a negotiation," even as U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reiterated the U.S. is committed to de-escalation. Global leaders have expressed concerns over the worsening situation. India's very own Ministry of External Affairs has put out a statement saying both countries must show restraint, and stability and security in the region is of utmost importance. Meanwhile, because of these tensions, what you're seeing is soaring oil prices. You have seen crude oil prices touch the highest level in 3 months. There are fears that this is just the start, and we could see tensions escalating between the U.S. and the Middle East. What is this going to mean for oil-consuming nations like India? What is it going to mean for bond yields? Is gold going to once again become the safe haven? I'm going to be discussing the economic impact of this rising tension between U.S. and Iran-Iraq on the other side. Joining me this Friday, Paul Hicken, the Associate Editorial Director for Europe and Africa Oil News and Analysis at Platts. I'm also being joined by Abhishek Kumar, Senior Energy Analyst at Interfax Global Energy. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here on the India development debate. Paul, I'm going to come to you first. The tweets and all of that is coming out, the kind of noise that you're seeing from the United States as well, urging its citizens to leave, weekend meetings being planned meanwhile when it comes to Iran and Iraq, threatening to take revenge. Do you really believe this is over?
No, this is an escalation of tensions. We saw with the Iran tanker disputes back in the summer, and then we had the Abqaiq attack in September, which was a huge escalation from Iran in that sense, and it sent a shock to the market. Yes, the market absorbed that shock quite well, and Saudi Aramco, the major oil company there, has reassured the market. But again, it's continuing to brew on, and this raises the stakes hugely for the oil market. But we should remember, and I think it's worth pointing out right at the beginning, that the oil market is well supplied. We've got the fundamentals. You've got to look at the fundamentals, not just the geopolitical risk. And we've got still lots of stocks in the OECD regions, lots of stocks in China, and we've got emergency stocks, IEA stocks, lots of buffers still exist in the market. So we should, and also remember that US shale is a marginal producer. As prices rise, that incentivizes US shale producers. They can bring back crude quite quickly. So we should take into account those factors about the oil market right now.
So let's talk about the oil market a lot more. Let me go across to Abhishek for that. It's his domain expertise. Abhishek, we've seen today the reaction for global crude oil prices along expected lines. It is, of course, the winter season as well. It's bad news for the Indian market and the consuming nation like us that also imports 80% of our needs. What are you penciling in? Further upside, a lot more of the upside?
So what we think is that the assassination of Qaseem Soleimani certainly marks a major escalation in tensions between Iran and the West. And what we also expect is that Iran will retaliate, but how is yet to be seen. And that how is going to determine where prices move from here. But one thing that is also certain is that any tensions, any escalation in geopolitical tensions in the Middle East will prompt price volatility, at least in the short term. Now, the implications of what's happening now that there can be various manifestations of this. So like, for example, what Iran can do in terms of flows via the Strait of Hormuz, for example, and what are the implications for US allies in the region, for example, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. And at the same time, what are the implications for the proxy wars? Those are ongoing in Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and so on. So it's a lot going to be driven by the sentiment in the market. And one thing we can say is that if tensions continue for any prolonged period, that's certainly going to be bullish for oil prices. And geopolitics could be one reason that can drive oil prices even higher than $100 per barrel.
Paul, our other panelist, Abhishek from Interfax, is now talking about the possibility of a triple-digit price for crude, $100 and more per barrel, if you continue to see this kind of escalation. It's not great, but you're already seeing hashtags like World War III trending on social media. You're seeing a fear on the stock markets. You are seeing a sell-off across the world when it comes to the global markets. Triple-digit figure, would you agree with him, or would it be wishful thinking to say that maybe the United States and Saudi Arabia will talk to each other, they're great allies, and say that let's not have the consuming countries suffer so much?
I think you have to be careful about banning around certain prices. Yes, there is a risk in the market. How long that risk goes on depends on how it escalates. Obviously, it's very uncertain times. But at the same time, you've got to remember that neither side want extreme escalations here. You've got a US election year. While it's not going to go down too well if oil prices go through the roof for US consumers as well in that typical year, and for Iran as well, it could be very costly. So I think you've got to be careful about where this could go. Obviously, the stakes are very high, and that uncertainty is going to make the oil market and other markets very jittery. So I think you've got to keep that in mind. But at the same time, it really depends. Where does the extra supply come from if the market gets knocked out in a certain way? And that's, you've got to be looking at. The US is the one way you think they could produce extra crude at quick rate. You've got Guyana and Norway and Canada who could provide some supply. But once you start looking at spare capacity, for example, that's historically at low levels. Only really Saudi Arabia has a significant amount of crude to bring on. And then you're looking at elsewhere. And so there is that concern in the market as well.
And at times like that, then, Paul, the capital flows becomes an issue. Now, Abhishek, Paul is reminding us about how it is an election year. Even if you see Mike Pompeo's interviews to TV stations in the United States, he has said, we don't want a war, but we had information and intelligence of how, General Soleimani was going to carry out imminent attacks against U.S. civilians, and that had to be thwarted. That's the kind of messaging that is coming out from the U.S. So having said that, the economic impact, once again, of course, a lot of uncertainty. There was just good news that was coming in about a possible first phase of the trade deal between Beijing and Washington, D.C. They're certainly going to spoil all of that.
As you rightly said, that it is a lot of politics going on, and that's going to be the case for the rest of the year. However, what has happened in the Middle East, the assassination of Soleimani, that is a major development. So we cannot expect for Iran not to react. Iran will react. The question is in which form and to what extent. So now we are in a situation where this whole scenario has been created. So it's not just politics. Now we have moved beyond politics, beyond US domestic politics. So that's why the situation is very fragile, and it's anyone's guess at this point which way it's going to go. but there is a risk of a significant rise in oil prices.
So Abhishek, you're talking about crude oil prices, but it's not just crude, it's also gold. It's at a 4-month high. Look at the Japanese yen. It's considered to be a classic barometer for testing investors' level of fears, and it's gone up. Look at the currency markets around the world. And this is all going to come at the cost of countries like India, emerging markets, developing world. Once again, you're going to see portfolio reallocations unless we have certainty very soon.
Yeah, and as you rightly said, certainty at this point is in short supply. And a lot of that is to do with what's happening between trade relations between US and China. So what markets are also looking at is, can we have any tangible outcome from the negotiations that's going on between US and China? And the short answer is, so far, very little sign of it, despite the phase 1 deal that they have agreed upon. So there is a lack of tangible outcome on that front. So that's one factor, the manifestation of which we are seeing in the currency markets. And the outflow of investment from emerging markets. So that's certainly going to hit countries like India and even other emerging countries, like if you're looking at Argentina, for example, if you're looking at Turkey, for example. So all these countries will be at the receiving end. However, when we are looking at the oil market and the factors that are driving oil prices at this point in time, so we cannot ignore geopolitics. And then when you combine these two things together, then that becomes a double whammy for emerging markets. So you have got, on one hand, higher oil prices, or at least potential for higher oil prices. And then on the other hand, you have got weakening emerging market currencies, making it even more difficult for these emerging nations to buy oil.
Okay. I take your point, and with that, Abhishek, as well as Paul, I'd like to thank you both for joining us here to talk about not just the rising oil prices, but across asset classes. It's again all about uncertainty. We've seen the U.S. action, which is a reaction to what had happened, and Iran and Iraq quite clear that we are going to see further reactions. How much is this going to escalate is something that none of us know. But stay tuned to ET Now. We're right on top of this story, and through the day we have been. It's a big global story. Here are other market veterans, other experts with their take on asset classes going up.
A conflict of this nature has the potential to drag in pretty much the entire Middle Eastern oil-producing countries, because they're all aligned one way or another, for or against, either on the U.S. side or Iranian side. So it's a big deal. I think until the situation becomes more clear right now, it's going to be just a knee-jerk factoring in of the risk premium. Today's development has the potential to turn into a bigger war. The worst-case scenario that oil has always been contemplating in terms of the Middle East.
It really goes back to the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the Iran peace accord, which has really been the origin of this. Before that, Iran was relatively contained. Now Iran poses a serious threat. There is Iranian escalation. I think we should really be watching for that in places like Lebanon, which of course is very vulnerable at the moment because of a severe political and economic crisis. We should also expect to see escalation play out in Iraq, which obviously, apart from being a big major oil producer, is also an incredibly vulnerable situation. And we could see further tension in the Yemen theater, where there is a potential for direct confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
So we've covered the economic impact, what it's going to mean for crude oil prices, gold prices, bond yields, currency markets. But now I want to talk a little more about geopolitics, international relations, what this is going to mean for Indians. To talk about that is Michael Kugelman, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and a Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. I'm also being joined by Dr. Kanwal Sibal, the former diplomat and former Foreign Secretary. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here this Friday on the India Development Debate. Michael, I'm going to come to you first. You know, the first question I think a lot of Indians will be asking, whether it's immature or not, and I just want to get your views on that, because there has been a circular that's come out for the Pakistani airspace as well from the United States up to 2021. How safe is it going to be for them to continue going for their holidays to Tel Aviv and to Dubai and all of that?
Well, I should say that as I understand it, that circular on airspace in Pakistan was actually an update, a reissue. It was not necessarily a new update, the one that came from the FAA, but certainly that's significant. I think that the broader issue here is that we don't really know yet as to what the implications are going to be of this assassination of Soleimani, but I think it's quite clear that there is going to be significant destabilization in the Middle East, and I don't necessarily think that Iran will retaliate right away. I imagine it's going to want to wait some time to maintain uncertainty, and from there, perhaps retaliate in covert ways, targeting U.S. interests and so on in various parts of the region. Certainly a country like Pakistan, I think, would be vulnerable as it shares a border with Iran. It has a close relationship with Saudi Arabia, Iran's bitter rival. And, of course, Pakistan is also a place that has a significant relationship with the U.S., and there are significant U.S. interests in Pakistan. And so I think that's something to be concerned about. Afghanistan is another significant issue, given that you have 12,000 U.S. troops there, which, of course, is another country that borders Iran. So I think that the entire broader region is really going to be on edge for the foreseeable future, and particularly since we really don't know yet just how Iran may respond, but I think clearly Iran will respond. There's no way that they would let an assassination like this just go with no retaliation at all. And I think not knowing how Iran will respond, I think will just keep much of the region and other countries that are involved in the story here more on edge and more concerned.
Okay, so you set the stage for this and the impact that it could have in India. And let me go across to Dr. Sibal for all of that. Dr. Sibal, if you look at the reactions that have come in from Iran and Iraq, and they are planning revenge, they are threatening revenge at this juncture. You're talking about for the de-escalation that could take place. I want to lean on your expertise on India's foreign policy. Now, India does do business with Iran, with Iraq, particularly when it comes to crude and importing. What would you, if you could, what would your advice be? Like, how do you think India should be playing this?
Well, actually, we are in a difficult situation because of our interests in this region, which are vast in terms of the number of our expatriates, the crude oil imports from this region, the remittances that come. There are millions of people there, and if there is a conflagration in the region because of what has happened, it will severely damage our interests. Which also means that when it comes to nations like the U.S. and others who have to take decisions which they think are in their national interest, they don't worry about the impact of those decisions on their strategic partners. And in this case, India is all very fine to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific. But we have equally important interests in this region. And the United States, to my mind, if I may say quite bluntly, has been very irresponsible in doing this. It is essentially an act of war. There is no justification in international law for this action. Osama bin Laden, yes, when he was assassinated, it was justifiable because he was associated with the bombings of the World Trade Center and elsewhere in the United States. So it was a terrorist that was taken out. But here in this case, he's a general of the Iranian army. He was in Iraq. The United States is not involved with Iraq. There is no evidence that he was linked to any direct terrorist or any other kind of attack against U.S. assets. And therefore, to take him out and assassinate him officially in this manner will cause a lot of concern about the continuing U.S. unilateralism, and especially in an area where already the United States is very deeply involved, is in a quagmire in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And it has increased uncertainty all around for everyone. In terms of Iranian retaliation, well, on the face of it, it would seem that they will they will avenge themselves in some way or the other, but that is not helpful to us either, because if they then retaliate and cause further tensions and aggravate the situation in the region, it will also impact on our interests. Therefore, both in terms of the U.S. action and Italian retaliation, we are caught in a very difficult position. So all that we can do is to counsel restraint and perhaps with like-minded powers, if anybody is ready to come out, to do something in terms of preventing a deterioration of the situation. But I can't see this happening because this is purely in terms of U.S. domestic politics, and that will be the overriding consideration.
In fact, taking that point forward, sir, what you just said, let me go across to Michael for that. Michael, you remember when the Bill Clinton impeachment was going on, he had also attacked Iraq. That famous newspaper clipping is, of course, going viral on social media, that, the coincidence of what happened during the Clinton era and during the impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. But having said that, it is an election year. New Year's Eve began with some good news that we were going to see a deal between Beijing and Washington, D.C. There were talks of a phase 2 of a deal as well. And now you've got this kind of an escalation. And this is not good news for India. I want to talk to you about the Indian impact. Like you talked about, for example, the U.S. troops in Afghanistan, the destabilization that you may also see with as a cascading impact in Pakistan.
No, absolutely. And I think Ambassador Sybil has laid out exactly why India needs to be so concerned. I think that it puts New Delhi in a difficult spot where, it definitely has made very clear it wants to continue to deepen its defense partnership with the United States. But at the same time, Iran is an important country for India, certainly for reasons of energy and economic cooperation, even though, as I understand it, India has reduced its energy imports from Iran because of U.S. sanctions on Iran. But India is going to find itself in a very difficult spot, I think particularly because of its geographic proximity to the broader Middle East region, and given its significant ties not just to Iran, but to other countries that could be affected in the broader region, whether you're talking about Iraq or Saudi Arabia, and also given the fact that there are quite a large number of Indian nationals and interests and assets in the broader Middle East. I think for all those reasons, India needs to be very concerned. And I think I agree with what Ambassador Sybil said, that in different circumstances, you could simply hope that India would counsel both the U.S. and Iran to use restraint and all that, but we're beyond that point. What happened with this assassination of the Quds head, of the Quds Force head, this is an act of war, as Iran would understand it. And so I think that we're on an inevitable path of escalation. I don't think de-escalation is an option in the immediate future. And as I said, I don't think Iran will necessarily retaliate right away. It's going to wait things out a bit, which will get people more nervous. But this puts India in a very difficult spot, and I would argue that for a government that at least over the last few months has really been prioritizing domestic issues and social agenda, I think that what's happened here over the last few hours will make it very important for India to accord more policy space and more attention to its foreign policy and to its diplomatic considerations, just because, this is a major crisis. It's one of the biggest crises for foreign affairs in quite some years, and India is going to be affected in some ways. I think it's going to need to redirect a bit and focus more on what it needs to do, A, to secure its interests in the Middle East, and B, to try to position itself diplomatically, where it sort of has to try to square a circle, trying to continue to work with the U.S., continue to work with Iran at a very volatile moment for foreign affairs.
In fact, there's a very valid point that you're making. It's going to be a test, not just for the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but also our new Minister of External Affairs, Minister Jai Shankar, how he's going to react to this. And Dr. Sybil, if I could take that point across to you. Now, you've already seen the United States issue instructions for evacuation, right? you just heard Michael make that very valid point, how you have a large base of Indians in these countries. So far, the commentary that's come out from India is saying we want stabilization, we don't want, we want to see de-escalation, but nothing convincing is yet from the Modi administration yet for all the Indians that may be stuck and that are residing in those countries.
Well, while I have spelled out what the dangers are, but let's also not over-dramatize the situation. Firstly, Iran, yes, will seek revenge, but it is in no position to launch a serious military strike against U.S. assets. It can do it indirectly by doing something in Saudi Arabia or through Yemen or in Afghanistan, where they have had links with the Taliban. They can indirectly give some support to the Taliban to attack U.S. assets. If they did something in the Persian Gulf, in that area, that would hurt them because they have to also export oil, and they're dependent even more now on whatever revenue they can get from oil exports. So they can't afford to stop export of oil from this region. In other words, their choices are limited. So I think, yes, they could do something vis-a-vis Israel through the Hezbollah, but these will all be relatively, to my mind, small-time actions. And it will then depend on the United States when the interests of its allies are hit, whether it will further escalate the situation and do something more. And in the meantime, there will be all this uncertainty and pressure on crude prices, and India will be caught in this bind. But it is too early, far too early, to envisage a situation where we have to think in terms of pulling back some of our people. It's impossible to do that in any case. I don't visualize an all-out conflict because Iran is not in a position to enter into a conflict of that magnitude. And the U.S., despite Trump's action, I don't think the U.S. Would also want to generate a serious additional conflict in the Middle East of a dimension that was Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan. So I think it's a very difficult situation for everybody. And the prime responsibility, frankly, is on the United States of America. It's the most powerful country in the world. It wants to have an international order which is based on the rule of law. But then they have to take the lead in this matter and not take action which is clearly in violation of international law and seriously irresponsible in terms of the aggravation of tensions in an already volatile region where the interests of its own partners are involved. It's not only India, it's Saudi Arabia, it's the UAE, it is Bahrain, it is Israel. All these countries have interest in peace and stability of a certain kind, and not this kind of disruptive military action by the United States.
In fact, let me take that question across to Michael as well. Michael, would you agree with Dr. Sibal over there about his views when it comes to unjustified acts and an act of war by the United States? Even if you look at what Donald Trump has been tweeting, he's put out a new tweet right now talking about how Major General Soleimani has killed thousands of Americans. Mike Pompeo has been giving interviews to television networks in the United States about how the U.S. has managed to thwart attacks that they had intel on. Would you concur with Dr. Sibal, or do you have a different opinion?
No, I do agree that this is a very irresponsible move by the United States, that it appeared to be wholly disproportionate, a wholly disproportionate response to what had happened earlier when, of course, you had these Iran-aligned protesters trying to storm the U.S. embassy. Yes, that's very threatening, and that's a very troubling thing for the United States. But to go out and assassinate, who is essentially one of, if not the most powerful individual in Iran, and knowing, I'm sure, that this could cause rampant blowback, destabilization, reprisals in the region against U.S. interests and against Americans, very irresponsible. Unfortunately, I don't want to speculate too much, but I do think, as you noted before, that this being an election here, the presidential election less than a year away here in the U.S., that the Trump administration or Trump himself knew that he could perhaps derive some significant political mileage from his rank and file, from his base, that likes to see muscular shows of U.S. force, even if it doesn't support the idea of extended military presences overseas. So that's something to keep in mind. And, you know, one thing that has been consistent with this administration over its 3 years in power, and that is a fairly relentless, hard-line position toward Iran. Yes, there were some times when the administration suggested it may want to try to talk with Iran. That didn't get all that far. So I think that, you know, ideologically speaking, this is an administration that has really wanted to teach Iran a lesson, so to speak, all along. It was looking for an opportunity, and clearly it got one in this case. And unfortunately, for domestic political reasons here in the U.S., I think that there was an added incentive for the administration to act when it did. I don't want to speculate too much, but you know, I think that is part of it. But final note on this, you know, I've heard so many times in conversations with Trump administration officials that the chief objective, the chief goal for U.S. foreign policy is to protect American lives. So I think that the administration was genuinely, concerned in a huge way when you had this major threat to its personnel in the embassy in Iraq. And so it wanted to respond in kind to show that it would follow up on its interest to protect American lives, however possible, overseas. So it essentially took this action, which I would describe as irresponsible, but one that for the Trump administration would be meant to show that it's willing to back up its threats, to do everything possible to protect American lives and to retaliate against those that imperil those lives in a big way. It's, I think, a very irresponsible way of doing foreign policy, but I think that is what we've seen happening here.
Right. Okay. With that, gentlemen, we're completely out of time, so I'm going to wrap up, and I'll like to thank both of you for joining us this Friday evening to help us understand. It's very clear that India is in a very tough position with the United States doing what it has. India cannot be hostile against the United States. It can't be hostile against these Middle Eastern countries. It has, it is doing business. It needs the crude oil and all of that. And with the rising crude oil prices, it's bad news for an importing nation like India.